Welcome back to the Student Hub Live event for the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences here at the Open University. In this session, we're going to take a look at technology and more specifically, the importance of technology in belonging. Now, this idea is very, very complex because technology can both be an enabler and also an obstacle for people's identity and participation. So we're going to take a look in this session at two very different approaches about how humans are using and understanding technology. So I'm joined by Paul-Francois Tremlett from Religious Studies.
Hi.
And Sean Williams from Music. Okay, Sean, I must ask what this thing is and what it's got to do with the session today.
Well, this is a device that was designed in the 1950s in the German broadcast corporations specifically for making sound effects for radio. It's called a Hershkovitz Era radio play distorter. And it's very rare. It was hideously expensive at the time, and it only does one very sort of simple thing. But the reason I'm interested in it is because it was adopted by the electronic music composers and producers in the 50s and 60s and became a really important instrument for making live electronic music before you could buy a synthesizer or any sort of purpose-built device. This was a really key device, particularly for Karlheinz Stockhausen and his work.
So what does it do?
It really just filters different frequencies from any sort of signal. So you can remove the bass or remove the treble, and maybe you can make a voice sound as if it's talking on a telephone, or you can make it sound as if something's happening far away. It's not the most sort of exciting and an amazing kind of device.
I think it is. Can you give us a demo?
I can, yeah. We've got a microphone. So I'm going to just speak through it, and that's now not doing anything. But if I want to sound a bit more distant, I can just remove some of those frequencies, and maybe it sounds like I'm in another room talking. Or I can remove all the low frequencies, and it sounds maybe like I'm talking on an old-fashioned telephone. Hello, 1 2 1 2. And on the device itself, it says only use the fixed settings. But of course, what the electronic composers did very, very early on is move these settings in real time. I'm going to keep talking. I'm going to make just a noise sort of sound, and then I'll move this in real time. Okay.
Wow. So they did not do what was instructed.
No, I mean, actually engraved into the top of the device in German is only use the fixed settings, exclamation mark.
It would be.
Nur gerastete Stellungen benutzen.
But no idea of the consequences listed, which I guess is what happened.
Yeah, and it's what fascinates me is this repurposing. So using technology, which is perfectly good for one particular intended outcome, and then doing something else with it. You know, just using it for unintended consequences, and it's the creative use of that kind of technology that really fascinates me.
Okay, so we've got some questions quickly before we go on to you, Paul. I'm going to be interested to see how you top this.
Well, I'm not, am I?
So we'd like to know, has this been used for the Doctor Who theme? This sort of thing?
Has this
yeah.
Something very similar would have been, yes. Now, I'm glad that you picked up the Doctor Who reference there, because it is the Doctor Who is one of the most famous outputs from the BBC Radiophonic Workshop, which was of course the BBC's in-house department for creating sound effects for radio and for TV. In Germany, in all the different major German broadcast stations, they had their own departments in a similar way. In fact, the BBC was catching up way after the Germans. The Hörspiel or radio play was a really key part, partly of forging a new identity for Germany after the Second World War. And they had a huge budget to put into these things. The equivalent that you'd find in the Radiophonic Workshop would be cobbled together with bits and bobs of old spare parts. And I mean, famously, the Radiophonic Workshop was founded with a lot of the gear that was being thrown away from the Albert Hall because it was already obsolete. Whereas this, I mean, even in the late 60s, this would have cost the equivalent of about £20,000 to £30,000,
Wow.
which is way beyond the BBC's budget.
Yeah, lucky that wasn't in our previous session about inequality. We've asked people at home lots of different questions. One of them is, have you heard of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop? So let's see what you had to say. 86% said no, 14% said yes. We've got lots of other questions as well that we'd like to you to fill in. Do you love new technology? Does technology make you apprehensive for the future? Do you think AI, artificial intelligence, will surpass human intelligence? And are you familiar with the German avant-garde music from the 1950s, or are you familiar with Jamaican dub? Okay, Sean, we're going to come back to this topic because I have to see what Paul has got to offer, because religious studies, I mean, clearly there's a lot less of a link, and you certainly don't have any expensive tech, although arguably you've brought your phone in here, so we'll see what that's got to do with everything. But Paul, you're proposing here that the conceptual language of religions can be useful to understanding technology.
Absolutely. We tend to think of technology, of things in general, as inert, passive, and we humans are the active, agentive things in the world. We're the ones that make meanings and exchange symbols and all that kind of stuff. But with the advent of new technologies and artificial intelligence, the ability to maintain that sort of separation between active humans and passive objects, I think is increasingly difficult to sustain. And that's why I brought my phone in. Basically, this is in constant communication with other electronic devices. Whenever you're using it, it's always communicating. So, we have something that's essentially got an attribute of intelligence. It's communicating. What's the language of religions we can use? Maybe the language of animism or the language of fetishism, which imagines objects as having agency in their own right. And one of the ways I started to try and think about this was Amazons. We all know about the warehouse Amazons. We're probably all getting stuff delivered from there and using that. And inside Amazon warehouses, they're using new technologies in all kinds of interesting ways. The people who work in the warehouses, for example, wear bracelets that monitor their efficiency as workers and calculate how far they've travelled and how fast they're doing this or that task. And there's also robot co-workers in the warehouses that work alongside the people in the warehouse. So we have examples of these. Your face is a picture, Karen. In the warehouse, there's all this human technology working side by side. Now, if we go to the other Amazon, the one in South America, we have peoples indigenous to that part of the world have a relationship with the trees and anteaters and the other beings in that forest. And they don't see themselves as those things as separate or passive or inert. They regard those entities as having first-person perspectives on their environment, just as they do. So that would mean that just as a person walks through the forest and experiences it as an ego, as an I, so the anteater, so the trees, they experience the forest as an ego, as an I. Now, if we take some of those ideas and apply them to the Amazon warehouse, we start to think about the technology in a very different way, I think. And we can start to see the technology and the warehouse as living, agentive environments of which we're a part. And what that starts to do is, instead of agency just being located in the human, it becomes distributed among all the different entities that are in the warehouse. So the surveillance bracelets, the robot co-workers, the structure of the place itself, and obviously the humans in there have an agency together, distributed together.
So you're really interested in the extent to which, I guess, humans are robotized and robots are humanized.
Exactly.
And where that divide is. So we asked people at home a variety of questions, and one I'd like to pick up on is whether or not people think that AI, artificial intelligence, will surpass human intelligence, because ultimately, if we're looking at performance on task, there is this question about the extent to which being human matters. So let's see what you had to say. 50% said no, 30% said yes, 10% said maybe. I mean, this all stems on this whole idea of what we mean by intelligence. 60% now say no. Sorry, 60% said no. What do you make of that?
Well, Ray Kurzweil predicted the singularity, and according to his prediction, that's pretty imminent. The singularity is that moment when AI becomes sentient, and that's going to, according to him, that fundamentally changes our relationship with technology and allows us to overcome our biology, in fact. Whether he's right remains to be seen, of course, but I think 60% is an extremely surprising result. I would have anticipated people to be much more, I would expected a higher percentage expecting AI to surpass human intelligence quite quickly.
Well, I guess it depends on what we determine as being intelligent.
It does.
And also this whole idea, which I think is common between both of you, is the extent to which you consider robots or technology as doing one task very well or not, as the case may be, and whether or not it's something between those tasks as opposed to the efficiency of the person in Amazon or the use of the equipment, and where that human sort of has an impact or makes a difference. Also, we're asking humans this question. Wouldn't it be interesting if we asked the robots? Because they'd say something very different. But it does make, you know, us wonder about the future, and we ask people at home, does technology make you apprehensive for the future? Let's see what they have to say about that. So 64% saying sometimes, which of course I think is very natural.
I don't think I've ever seen such a big sometimes. Usually the percentage is more distributed between yes and no. 64% sometimes.
But again,
which times?
Well, this is the question, I think, because it's clear that at certain times, I think we would possibly be less worried about our phone communicating with the outside world, and I would have more of a problem with some sort of heart rate monitor or something predicting my performance at work than I would of a phone, even though arguably they could both be monitoring similar sorts of behaviour. So it's where this divide is and what the implications are of it.
You know, we make funny choices. We'd be apprehensive about the monitor at work, and yet we'd probably wear one of those things that counts your steps willingly and voluntarily. Well, what's the difference, really? You know, you're instrumentalizing yourself in a very particular way, and it's a very interesting thing to do, and a little bit weird as well.
I like the Amazon metaphor, I must say, because you might think, well, the thing to watch out for in the Amazon are the big cats. They're going to come, you know, they're going to be out to get you. And you might be worried if you did an audience question about, you know, how worried are you about the cats? They're, well, very worried actually. But it's probably the tiniest little things that are going to get you that you can't even see, or you don't really notice, you don't think about. But this ecological approach is actually something that we use in music as well. So. This is not an AI, this is not a clever device, and it's not an anteater, it's not going to go and do anything on its own. But all of the different elements that we use, or that composers and performers use, do have some sort of impact. And it's really easy to forget the significance, or to overlook the significance of all the different elements within the ecosystem. And it's terminology that we use in music as well, the ecology, or the ecological approach. And one thing that I find really exciting about the research that I do is trying to find those unexpected agents, if you like. So, you know, I'm not worried about the big cats. I'm you know, looking at the tiny little insects, or the odd things that we might have overlooked, and the ways in which humans interact with any of those sorts of devices. And that's one of the reasons that I really enjoy doing practice-led research. So I have to get my hands on devices like this in order to understand how they were used, or how they could be used. It's not something that you can just look in an archive and get a feel for, I suppose.
Now, I mean, this is a research showcase, so theoretically interesting as all of this is, I'd like to ask each of you how you're going about researching this. And you've said, you know, you've got this frightfully expensive and old piece of technology. But Sean, how are you going about researching? What data are you using? What sources are you using? And then what are you learning from it? And what is the point of all of that?
Gosh, that's a lot of questions all in one go.
One at a time. I'll pick you up on
I didn't bring a notepad. Hang on. You might have to remind me of those. Well, in terms of methodology, I'm using as many different methodologies as I need to. So archival is really important. I need to find things like the circuit diagram for this so that I can have an understanding of how it works. It took me a couple of years to actually track one down. The first one I found was in a sort of a museum shop in Berlin, and I was allowed to go and look at that and take it apart and have a look inside it. And it's a piece of it's a work of beauty inside, I must say. Then it took me another sort of 3 or 4 years to actually find one to get myself. Once I've got hold of one, then I've done a number of performances. So I've done some performances at the Science Museum in a sort of technology-related performances there. I've been using it to recreate some of the pieces that were made in the 50s, some of the sort of tape music pieces that were made over several months, or in some cases a couple of years to make a few minutes of music. So I've been trying to use them in the same kind of context as they would have been used before. Now, to couple that with some more sort of hard evidence, if you like, I've done ethnographic research. So I did a couple of very long interviews with Gottfried Michael Koenig, who was working in the Cologne studio, electronic music studio, from 1954 to 1964, and he was at the forefront and the cutting edge of all these sorts of technologies and used these devices and so on. So having long conversations with him about how he used them, I was able to match up my own experience with having used it. Before I found one, I made a mock-up of it and took that to a chap called Rolf Gehlhaar, who performed with the Stockhausen Ensemble in the 60s, using these very devices, and he showed me. I made a video of him demonstrating how they performed certain parts of the music and what settings they would have it on. And so I mean, all the evidence that I can find goes into a sense of how the human interaction with the technology happened and how it might have progressed and changed, and were there any particular key works or key examples or key transitional moments as well. So
you're looking at the sort of history and the use of something very old to understand how the music was created, how they went against the regulations and started using a lot of this in music for purposes unintended. But what's that got to do with technology now and the way that music's being created now? I mean, it's happened so rapidly if you think about the last 50 years of technological development in music, and I imagine the next 50 years as well will have massive gains in terms of what we can do. So speaking then of in terms of the timeliness of it, how does that then translate to what's happening now, what's happening when we learn about music at the OU, and what might happen then for the future with technology?
I think you've hit the nail on the head when you mentioned the speed of change. So when you've got something that changes very quickly, you can look at almost its whole life cycle in some respect. If you contrast, maybe it's easier if I contrast that with something like a cello, which you're familiar with. I would call a cello a very slow instrument. The basic form evolved over some time, but it's been pretty static. The number of strings, the dimensions. Maybe people have used different woods or varnishes, or there may be some very slight refinements, but it's pretty stable. Now that's allowed a lot of repertoire to be developed for the cello, and we look at it as if it's still and fixed. And because it's doesn't seem to be moving, it's as if we're looking at a still image. Now something like this is a bit quicker, although this is now 70 years old. It's a lot faster than a cello, but a lot slower than some of the technology that Paul's been talking about and researching. But it gives us a sense of being able to unpick the trajectory of how these things develop, and maybe then make a model with it, which we can use to look at even faster technologies. So that's sort of the principle of it, but how do we deal with this in what we teach? That's more of a challenge, because this is a thing, and they're very rare. So I did make a model of it, a software model for my own experimentation, but technology now allows us to have a full professional level recording studio with all the tools and technologies in a laptop. So we use some software called Reaper, in amongst our teaching for A232, which is the music, sound and technology module, where you can actually use sort of similar tools to this in software, and all the students can use that. So we do some exercises where we use basic tone generation, noise generation, and we use filters for the students to allow the students to then build up component by component sound elements, and then they eventually make a ringtone is actually one of the assessed submissions, and that sort of joins up the process of how these older technologies were used, which I've found out through my research, and then we've been able to structure that to make it relevant, so they can make a ringtone that might feature some of those kinds of processes.
Wow. So again, using new technology, and who knows what will happen then in the future in terms of what we can do with that. So Paul, so coming back to you, because we need to end the session in just a minute. So Sean's doing a lot of this work, and you sort of mentioned before about this man-robot sort of divide in terms of where things are at, and the sort of premise that you came here with was this idea that language could really help us understand some of this, and you mentioned the mobile phone as well that's communicating and not. So I'd like to sort of take a similar approach with Sean in terms of the point of this and how it feeds into teaching.
Yeah, so I'll be quick. So often we sort of frame or set up religion as something as opposed to science, and they're seen as two separate realms, and they don't really sort of overlap. So can we use religious language to help, or religious concepts or concepts derived from religion like fetishism or animism, to enable public understanding of technology, to help people understand the world that is emerging and changing so rapidly? So it's about public understandings of technology, public understandings of religion and technology, really, okay? So that's the research side. That would be that's ethnographic research into how people are articulating their relationships with things like mobile phones or even more antique objects of this kind, which that is fantastic. By the way, relationship to teaching. So I'm currently writing for a new module, DD218, which is a sociology module, and that's all about understanding digital societies, exploring human relationships with things. For example, all sorts of things from cockpit simulations to the Turing test, to Amazon and working with colleagues in sociology on that module, and I think it's going to be a really exciting module, and I hope students are really going to enjoy it.
No, it sounds fascinating, and I guess so much of this is relevant now because, as you say, this divide is becoming so much more blurred, and so it's important that we understand our relationship with technology so that we can use it and use the humanness of it. And the things as well. So it's important. It's
extremely important. Technology, and one of the things we've talked about is the rapidity of technological change. And one of the things that amazes me is how quickly we adapt to new technology. On the one hand, mobile phones are invented, and then we're all walking around using them, doing all sorts of, finding all sorts of new ways.
And not phoning on them.
Well, indeed, not phoning on them anymore, using other apps and so forth. However, if we look at, on the other hand, as it were, technological change is taking us by surprise because it's upsetting our anticipations around work and employment and about what a workplace should be like, whether we have a job that's skilled or not skilled, and all those kinds of questions. So on the one hand, we seem to be really flexible and agile and adaptable to new things. On the other hand, those things are very unsettling and changing the way we relate to them, the objects, and one another. And that goes, I think, connects importantly to previous sessions you've been doing on belonging and inequality. Yeah. Is AI going to give us, is it a dystopian future, a shrunken, de-skilled workforce on low pay? Lots of people think that might happen. Lots of people also think maybe it'll be the fully automated luxury communism model, where we're in a land of plenty because the robots are doing all the work. Probably also, both those eventualities are probably both wrong, right? But that's the kind of spectrum that people are thinking along.
Well, some food for thought there.
Yeah.
We're going to have to end now on that, I'm afraid. But thank you so much, Sean and Paul. That's been a fascinating conversation. Never thought I'd say this, but I'm glad to see we're going to be having some philosophy next. But first, we're going to play a video. We're going to have a Who's Who video and show you Gemma Allen. And then, leading into our next session, we will hear from Derek Matravis on a video, Should We Risk Lives to Protect History? Because I'll then be talking with Sean Cordell about heritage in war. So join me for that next session after these two videos.